But Ryan, talk to us, do most people think about MFA in the same way? Talk to us about that. Talk to us about trends. I'd love to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, they actually don't think about MFA the same way. A cyber pro understands MFA as a three-factor framework, which is something you have, something you know, or something you are, right? Each of those being individualized factors. And within those factors, there's a range of optionality going from weak to strong. And so it's really just, we love our frameworks and information security. So again, MFA is a three-factor framework. And so, for example, within something you have, which would typically be a one-time password, that might be something that gets texted to you as an SMS. That would be considered a weak factor for something you have. Or maybe I have a physical hardware token like a YubiKey, that would be considered a strong factor of something I have. So we tend to think about it in a more structured way using a three-factor framework. I think technology pros maybe understand that to some extent, but really they're looking at MFA as passwords and one-time passwords, right? They're aware of biometrics, which is something you are. But really, from their perspective, passwords just tend to be problematic for their users, for SMBs. They don't set great passwords. They're commonly compromised. It's just a big problem. So they recognize the need for a second factor. To them, that really just comes in the form of a rotating or one-time time-based password, what we call a TOTP. Again, those tend to be either SMS, TOTP applications like Google Authenticator, Authy, etc. So we don't necessarily think about it the same way. In terms of trends, increasingly we are seeing this kind of conversation about password lists, which is really just a fancy way of saying MFA without the something right? Your password, right? So it means your MFA is something you have and something you are, meaning biometrics and like a time-based one-time password. And so we definitely see the trend kind of moving in the direction of a password list. We're seeing a lot of great stuff out of Microsoft and kind of their Azure Active Directory, kind of single sign-on solutions, the stuff that they're doing with Hello Microsoft, obviously Apple's ecosystem with Touch ID and face recognition. Like that stuff is becoming more mainstream. And I think, in terms of the next 3 years, looking at my crystal ball, we will move more towards a passwordless multi-factor authentication, right? So we'll still do MFA, we just won't do MFA with passwords. We'll be using the other two factors in the three-factor framework.
Really cool, Ryan. Really cool, Ryan. Ryan, you're big into threat modeling. Can you share a little bit about MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE Shield and how it applies to MFA?
Yeah, so as Phyllis noted, right, there's a tremendous amount of research that, I think Verizon even says like 80 to 90% of data breaches involve the theft of a valid credential, which means multi-factor authentication is an incredibly strong compensating control to that type of attack. So if we look at MITRE has two frameworks, ATT&CK and Shield. ATT&CK is an expression of the tradecraft that attackers use, or what we call TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures. So that's a way of expressing what the bad guys do. Shield is a way of expressing for defenders what they should do to defend against those TTPs. And so if we look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, there's a technique in there. It's the technique ID is T111, that's 4 ones. And it's called two-factor authentication interception. It's a technique which effectively says attackers will seek to abuse weaker MFA-based mechanisms, weaker TOTP-based mechanisms. So they will try to abuse and work around SMS. They will try to work around, time-based one-time password applications, and maybe even take advantage of some hardware-based MFA solutions like smart cards. So okay, cool. We know that now we have MFA, but MFA is potentially vulnerable to interception, which is what the technique tells us. So what Shield says is the defender can enforce strong authentication requirements, including password changes, two-factor authentication, etc. So really what it says is, and the keyword there is strong. So going back to how cyber pros think about MFA, we think about the factors, and then each factor has a spectrum of weak to strong. We need to be picking the strong factors in each of the two that we're selecting. So ideally moving as far up the strength meter as possible in terms of something you have. And until we live in a passwordless world, like this something you know needs to be as strong as possible. So that's why you see things like password managers, complexity requirements, rotation, things like that, really trying to make those passwords as strong as possible until biometrics can really pop on the scene and like wipe out passwords entirely. So Shield and Attack are actually great for exploring not only where MFA, can just pure MFA, weak or strong, can combat attacker techniques, but it also, as I just illustrated with this technique, can inform us of how to prevent even some of the attacks against two-factor authentication. So it's an incredibly powerful framework. And as Phyllis said, they're mapping to it in CIS. So you can actually sit down with the framework and you can look at a lot of this stuff in one place. And I think that's pretty phenomenal, because it really, when we talk about risk-based, informed, threat-informed security programs, all that stuff is kind of coming together thanks to the work that CIS is doing.
Great.